All right, welcome everyone to a new episode of the Roscoe's Wetsuit Neuro podcast. I am your host, Toby Passman. On the show with us today, we have a very special guest, Abelard Lindsay. Abelard is currently the Director of Research and Development at Natural Stacks. He used to be a software developer residing in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he also works at an internet-related company in San Francisco, working on his master's in computer science. Abelard has helped develop the product CILTEP, along with dopamine brain food, serotonin brain food, GABA brain food, and acetylcholine brain food in conjunction with Natural Stacks. So Abelard, it's a real pleasure having you on the show today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. That bio's a little bit out of date. I actually finished my master's in CS, and I recently finished a JD too. Just took
Congratulations.
Yeah, so still working in software development, but anyway, and working on supplements and developing and researching new cognitive enhancement stacks, that kind of thing.
Tell me what originally got you interested in playing around with different formulations and different nootropics to enhance your cognitive performance?
Well, I have always been interested in the brain and improving my performance, as a software developer, and just in general, optimizing mood. And, I had, when I was very young, I had brain cancer when I was 12, and I recovered from that. And, I was a little off for a couple of years after that, and slowly regained it. And I've always sort of felt intuitively like before I had brain cancer, everything was like a lot easier. And I always was thinking like, I know I've felt that potential. I want to know how to get back there and feel that way that I did when I was before that. And so I've been researching this stuff since the mid 2000s, way back in the day on the longevity forums. I mean, they're not as popular as they used to be, but back then, and still today, they are a great place where people go to talk about brain health and argue about various topics, bring up medical studies, and there's a lot of debate and production of information that's very useful. And one of the things that I got interested in while studying this stuff, I mean, when you take smart drugs for a long time, it becomes easy to remember a lot of things and kind of build up a lot of information. And so on these forums, I would just keep reading and looking at all these different angles for improving cognitive performance. And one interesting angle was PDE4 inhibition. There had been a number of attempts at finding synthetic drugs that would inhibit PDE4s, phosphorylesterase 4, to combat neurodegenerative conditions. I think in one article where they're talking about the potential, they called it brain Viagra. And I was looking at these synthetic drugs that they were developing, and they all had the problem that they caused vomiting at low doses. And there was also an article that said that when combined with forskolin, they could chemically induce long-term potentiation, which is a process critical to long-term memory formation. And so I looked at the same time in East Asia and India and so forth, they were taking apart Ayurvedic medicine, Chinese traditional medicine, and trying to find the molecular biological mechanisms of action of these various Chinese traditional and Ayurvedic medicines by looking at these herbs and doing studies with them. And one of the things I found out was there were natural PDE4 inhibitors, and those natural PDE4 inhibitors were weak, not as strong as these synthetic ones, but they did not cause vomiting. And what I figured out, the fundamental insight, was when I combined these natural PDE4 inhibitors with forskolin, it had a cognitive enhancing effect. And I was really surprised by this, and I was a little concerned at how could this work so well. There must be some side effect or something. And so I took it for a couple of months, and then everything was just going great. So I went on to Longevity. I said, hey guys, here's this idea I came up with. Here's how I think it works. Here's some medical studies. Here's my theory. Here's the ingredients. Tell me what you think. And so this thread started up, and it over the course of several years, it got to like 2,000 replies and 500,000 views. And then Tim Ferriss endorsed the product in like a Google Tech Talk and on a podcast. And then a lot of commercial interest started showing up, and I hooked up with a supplement company, Natural Stacks, and we put out a product, and that was in 2013. And I've developed several, the whole brain food line after that, but things have been doing great since then. I mean, we've got a really strong, loyal following of people who take that product, and we've had a number of really wild things happen with the development of the product. For instance, in 2014, Martin Jacobson, who's a professional poker player, contacted us and said they really like CILTEP and he wanted to work with us promoting it. And I wasn't directly involved in this. This is our stellar marketing department in Natural Stacks. They hooked him up with a documentary film crew, and they followed him to Las Vegas to play in the 2014 World Series of Poker. And they gave him a patch, which he ironed onto his shirt right here. This is powered by CILTEP. And he ended up winning $10 million at the World Series of Poker, which is the largest prize in all of professional poker, I think. And the two founders of Natural Stacks were there in the stands when he won. It was kind of a wild moment. Since then, we keep growing our following. Things get better and better.
So can you tell me a little bit more about PDE4 inhibition and kind of how these ingredients, like the artichoke extract you mentioned, combined with the forskolin, what is that actually doing in the brain, and how is that really benefiting people?
Okay, well, when the way long-term potentiation happens is cyclic adenosine monophosphate in neurons increases to a level that it activates CREB, which is this transcription factor. And what a transcription factor is it goes into the nucleus of the neuron, and it turns on all this machinery that strengthens the connections to the other neurons around it. And that's how a long-term memory forms that can last a lifetime. And normally this process is triggered by dopamine, combined with signals coming in from a short-term memory. And short-term memory is a whole nother process where, you have, which is the electrical connections between neurons. After they receive a certain pattern of signals called a tetanus, they recruit AMPA receptors to the synaptic cleft, and the connection gets stronger. But then that all cascades down to ERK, and then if there's dopamine present, it increases CAMP levels in cyclic adenosine monophosphate, which is, I'll just call CAMP for short, levels in the cell, which activates CREB, and that makes the cell kind of generate this, activate this machinery to strengthen its connections. So what CILTEP does is there's this enzyme that breaks down CAMP, which is called PDE4, phosphorylesterase 4, and it's and if CAMP is broken down, it stops the cellular machinery from growing this connections to other neurons. But if CAMP is increased to above a certain threshold, that activates that. So what this does is it slows the breakdown of CAMP, and it also increases CAMP through forskolin's activity. Forskolin is well known to increase CAMP broadly around the body and the brain. And so in that way, we make it easier for the body to activate CREB and do this process whereby it creates long-term memory. And the way that I like to kind of explain that sort of on a normal level that is more familiar, is to talk about, when you go on a vacation, you're someplace new and you've never been there before, and it's all very novel. And dopamine is triggered a lot by novelty. It's kind of a novelty detector in the brain. So it activates this process, and that encodes long-term memory. And that's why when one goes on vacation, it's usually easier to remember that week of one's life where one was on the trip to like France or wherever, as opposed to the normal day-to-day grind, what you have for breakfast yesterday, that kind of thing. It's not very, it's not novel, so the dopamine is not activated. So it makes it easier to go into the state of fascination and wonder, where it becomes easier to learn. Like the great teachers, they always inspire wonder and awe on that kind of thing. So it's sort of that state of mind. It's like an aroused state where memories encode. So that's how it fundamentally works.
And I personally, I played around with CILTEP, more than just played around with it. I took that, for a couple of years, I would say, during my undergraduate, and pretty consistently, and definitely noticed just the memory formation. I had to spend way less time. I needed to spend way less time studying a selection of material in order to then say recall it, on a test later that week. It significantly cut that studying time down, in my experience. So that was really cool. Tell me about, there's a few other ingredients in CILTEP, acetyl L-carnitine, L-phenylalanine, and vitamin B6. Can you talk to me about why you added those to the formula?
Yeah, well, one thing that happens when CREB is activated is tyrosine hydroxylase tends to be upregulated, and that's the enzyme that takes tyrosine, which phenylalanine converts to tyrosine, and that's the intake for like dopamine metabolism. So it makes it so that the brain processes these amino acid precursors from food to produce dopamine at a faster rate. And so that's just to pick up for any increased usage of dopamine precursors. So phenylalanine turns into tyrosine, turns into L-dopa, turns into dopamine through this metabolic process. So it's fuel for the increased neuronal activity. And B6 is a cofactor in dopamine metabolism, helping it move along between those the stages of processing. And then there was a study that said that the histone acetylation and deacetylation, which is how CREB turns things on and off in a neuron, turns different genes on and off to help the neuron connect to other neurons. That is powered by, there's some research that says that's powered by the acetyl groups of acetyl L-carnitine, and that's kind of that's helping power that process. And also acetyl L-carnitine is important in memory and physical coordination, that kind of thing. Just generating acetyl groups for acetylcholine to form.
So you mentioned acetylcholine, and I think we touched on dopamine too. So what I'd like to do now is kind of break down kind of the different, some of the different neurotransmitters, and kind of talk about, first, I guess, what they are, why they're important, and then we can get into talking about the brain food line in terms of how you can actually increase those neurotransmitters. So maybe we could start with serotonin. Can you tell me a little about what serotonin is, why it's important?
Yeah, well, serotonin is important. I mean, it's produced a lot in the gut, for digestion and so forth, but it's also in the brain. It's associated with mood, positive mood, and it's without it, it tends to lead to anxiety, depression, disturbed mood. So the way that serotonin works is it comes in as L-tryptophan, which is in meats. So there's a lot in turkey, but also in certain sources of vegetarian diets, like any complete protein. And then it turns into 5-HTP, which is another popular supplement, and then into serotonin, and then into melatonin. But if there's high levels of cortisol present, there's some research that says that it can turn into kynurenic acid, which is this, and then eventually into niacin. But that's some research I was reading said that's how stress is linked to depression.
Is that taking tryptophan that can get converted? Is that what you're referring to?
Right. Instead of tryptophan getting converted into serotonin, it gets converted to kynurenic acid, and so that's the way that high cortisol levels, cortisol is linked to stress, can link stress and depression. So the idea I came up with in serotonin brain food was to add rhodiola, which is known to, which has some research that says it controls cortisol, in order to keep that pathway from being activated excessively to go to not produce serotonin. So that was the idea I came up with the serotonin brain food. It's, because I'm thinking about these things in systems instead of what are these individual ingredients doing. I'm thinking about, well, how do you make serotonin, and then how can that go wrong, and what are the cofactors, that kind of thing.
Why use tryptophan compared to 5-HTP? What was the thinking there?
The thinking is that I read this study a long time ago that was saying that the reason that there was this diet drug called fen-phen, and it was removed from the market because it activated serotonin receptors in the heart, which caused fibrotic growth, and that caused like heart problems and stuff, because it was like a diet drug, and like I think the 5-HTC3 receptor, which is there's a bunch of different receptors for serotonin. It's present in the brain. It controls appetite, but it's also present in the heart. And I think it's better to just have the body control where tryptophan turns into 5-HTP, just to make sure it doesn't do it in the bloodstream and kind of then turn into serotonin in the wrong place. I just thought it was like, I like to take these supplements every day, and I want to take them every day without having to think about any possibility of any sort of side effects for the rest of my life. So I just thought that was a more sustainable way that I could design them so that there wouldn't be any risk. I mean, I don't even know if there's there hasn't been any long-term studies to see if there's a significant risk, but people have talked about it over the years as a possible issue theoretically. So I was just thinking, I want to just do the most sustainable thing that's going to be best for long-term daily usage of the product.
Let's move on to talking about dopamine.
Okay. So dopamine, people think it's the pleasure chemical, but the pleasure chemical are opioids, and you don't want to touch opioids. Don't do that. Don't stimulate your opioid receptors in any way that's not completely natural, is my advice. But dopamine is the compulsion chemical. It's what says, okay, we're doing something and let's keep doing it, or let's do that, or okay, I have this idea. I think it would be fun to go to the beach today. Okay. Yeah, I believe it will be good to go to the beach. I'm planning to go to the beach. I'm at the beach. That's dopamine, right? And if people who have like excessive amounts of dopamine kind of get ideas and kind of go from believing them to doing them really quickly. So so it's one of these things where it's sort of like, I have an idea, I'm planning it, I'm doing it, and I'm continuing to do it. So it's really important for motivation. If the low levels of dopamine, there's no motivation to do anything too much, and you get really excited about everything. Like people, are really into like stimulants, like they spend a lot of time excessively doing things that aren't really worthwhile. So, so the way I kind of approach this is I say, well, instead of directly stimulating all these dopamine pathways, let's see how the body naturally takes the precursors to dopamine, phenylalanine and tyrosine, and then turns them to all the intermediate products along the way, and creates dopamine, and also breaks down dopamine. So, so the way that works is in dopamine brain food, we start out with the dopamine precursors, right? Phenylalanine, which also turns into, which stimulates, it either turns into tyrosine or it turns into a product that stimulates the TAR1 receptor, which is what Adderall stimulates. But it's on a natural level, and the body knows how to break it down and regulate it. So, I mean, that phenylalanine is important for that, basically fueling that. And that there's phenylalanine in eggs and most meats and cheeses and dairy products and that kind of thing. So it's a natural amino acid that we get in our diet. And then vitamin B6 is responsible for as a cofactor for helping the process of turning tyrosine into dopamine. And in between tyrosine and dopamine, there's L-DOPA. And I was thinking, look, maybe I put Meconia pruens in there, which is L-DOPA, but then I was thinking, nah, it's better to let the body decide how much L-DOPA it needs by kind of turning up the upregulating or downregulating tyrosine hydroxylase, rather than just skipping that step. And that's an important thing that I try to be mindful of, is I don't want to skip metabolic steps. I want the body to have a way to regulate these intermediate steps, and to use natural ingredients that the body knows how to move around and get rid of excesses of, and so forth, rather than anything sort of synthetic or that the body's not used to. So then vitamin C is, everybody loves vitamin C, besides being an antioxidant and having a lot of brain health benefits. It is used to transfer between dopamine and the later stages of dopamine metabolism, like epinephrine and norepinephrine. And so then there's a methylation complex, and methylation is this cycle in the body that is responsible for a lot of metabolic processes. And one of the processes is breaking down dopamine into the later stages of dopamine metabolism, and eventually, the dopamine's broken down and excreted in the urine, and so it helps. Same with adrenaline and noradrenaline. And so the way that works is, you have this SAM cycle where it goes from like SAMe to homocysteine to methionine, and it just goes around in a circle. And vitamin B12, trimethylglycine, and folate all are important cofactors in this process. It's pretty complicated. But yeah, I wrote a couple of papers on it and how all the little pieces work. I mean, there's, I've got this, the Roche, the drug company, puts out this metabolic cycles, and they've got like this huge map of like all these, how one thing turns into another and so forth. So that's how dopamine brain food works. And it's basically there to just make sure that you have all the cofactors and inputs to really power the whole processing of dopamine.
So I've heard some people talk about, when it comes to, say, like a substance like Adderall, where if you have ADHD and there are kind of this deficits in dopamine, and then someone takes Adderall, it can be very helpful for them to be able to focus and concentrate, get their work done. Whereas if someone, say, doesn't have ADHD, already has kind of healthy levels of dopamine, and then artificially enhances them with a substance like that, they can get, either kind of euphoric and high, or just kind of zombified and their personality taken away. I just wanted to kind of ask you, in terms of with dopamine brain food, are there a wide variety of responses and reactions that people have to this product, kind of in regards to whether they may be low, people with low dopamine or high dopamine, or is it pretty consistent across the board?
Well, everybody's brain's a little different. You know, I'm a big fan of Eric Braverman's The Edge Effect, where, you know, he lays out how all the primary neurotransmitters in the brain work, and then you have like, you take a test and it tells you what your like dominance is, and you know, where you're lacking or where you need more of a certain neurotransmitter. And so I think that people should. I mean, one of the things I did with the stacks is I made them so you could take 1 to 3, so you could dial it up or dial it down based on personal preference, and how one's brain works. So it's sort of like, you know, you can set the equalizer on your neurotransmitters. But I'd say, yeah, everybody's brain works a little differently, and you know, some people have ADHD, and they really need you know, to work with their doctor, and I don't to you know, get these prescription drugs, and you know, there's nothing wrong with that. But this is, you know, more of a natural, gentler effect that's sort of working with the you know, natural mechanisms of the brain, and not really introducing something synthetic that's sort of pushing the buttons without you know, and that hasn't really kind of grown up alongside our evolutionary you know, way that we've kind of developed over the years, over the millennia, whatever, that you know, for instance, I mean, one place you really can go wrong is like with GABA receptors. Like, this isn't dopamine, but one GABA receptor agonist that's synthetic, that's not natural to the body, that people use a lot, is alcohol. And yeah, it works. It'll push the GABA receptor buttons, but those GABA receptors will downregulate, and that'll cause symptoms of withdrawal, and then over the long term, that can with chronic alcohol use, that can cause, you know, various types of brain damage, excitotoxicity, that kind of thing. So, but the regular GABA, though, which is the endogenous neurotransmitter that the body uses to stimulate GABA receptors, the brain can rapidly efflux that out of the brain. It can just, you know, it's got too much, it can just pump it out of the brain. So, you know, there's it's in my opinion, it's better to deal with these things using like natural vitamins and amino acids from food, and that's just a better way to go long term.
Now that we're already on the subject of GABA, can you talk a little more about kind of GABA's function in the brain, and then we can talk about kind of GABA brain food and how to actually enhance that in a way that's going to actually increase levels of GABA in the brain, which I know there's a kind of an issue with when it comes to just taking an over-the-counter GABA supplement alone.
Right. So the idea with GABA brain food is that, GABA generally is, GABA is the inhibitory neurotransmitter. It acts to slow down impulses in the brain. And the opposite of that is glutamate, which increases increases stimulation in the brain. And so there's a balance between them. And, you know, excess glutamate is associated with anxiety and just irritability and so forth. And GABA counteracts that. It subjectively, for me, it feels kind of like a mental shock absorber. It helps with social interaction. It helps with doing things that are normally frustrating. And the GABA, you have to be careful with it though, because GABA receptors, they don't like to be stimulated when with synthetic substances. They get a little, they tend to downregulate, and you have problems with all kinds of problems with like withdrawal and addiction and stuff like that. For instance, a lot of GABA receptor agonists are like drugs of abuse, like or just drugs that have problems like benzos and tranquilizers and alcohol and all that stuff. So so it's I always think like, okay, what's the most natural beneficial way that we can interact with GABA, and that's just to use the natural endogenous GABA agonist, which is GABA. So, but the problem with GABA is that it does not easily cross the blood-brain barrier. So in my research of GABA in the body and so forth, I discovered that there were some studies that said that nitric oxide helped GABA cross the blood-brain barrier. So what I did was I added nitric oxide, increasing ingredients like citrulline and grapeseed extract to GABA, and and then I self-experimented with it and found out that it had a better calming effect than just regular GABA. So that was the theory behind GABA brain food. Yeah, so that was so there basically when I go in to develop a supplement stack, I won't just look at single ingredients. I'll look at, okay, how is GABA metabolized? Also, GABA transaminase inhibitors. GABA transaminase breaks down GABA into glutamate, and so if you slow that process down, that increases the amount of GABA in the brain. Like and that's natural supplements like lemon balm and that contain rosmarinic acid. There's a those were the components that I put together in GABA brain food.
Question as far as like just in terms of the way you go about creating these different formulations, like what's kind of your process as far as kind of playing around with both the different ingredients along with the dosages of those ingredients? Like, are you trying these out yourself? Are you giving them to other people to also try out? Like what's your process in actually creating one of these?
Well, the process comes from the one I developed when I made CILTEP originally back in 2011. And that involves reading about these various aspects of brain chemistry and how they work, and how these thinking about from a systems perspective, where do these neurotransmitters come from? From food. What are the enzymes that process them, break them down? What are the cofactors? What natural herbal and vitamins and so forth, how do they affect them? And then coming up with some ideas and doing a lot of research, finding a bunch of research studies, and putting together a theory. And then I have to test the theory, which means I take these things every day for a couple of months. I have my milligram scale and I have my bulk supplements. I measure all this stuff out, and I do a lot of when I'm testing cognitive enhancing supplements. I use Cambridge Brain Sciences a lot, which is back in the olden days you could just play the flash games, and but now you have to sign up and they want you to do all this stuff. But I found ways to get those tests independently, and I've taken these tests hundreds of times, so I have a pretty good baseline. So and then I work with the Braverman neurochemistry tests to kind of gauge my mood and how I'm feeling, and that's the process that I use to make CILTEP, and it's kind of like just being a biohacker, and it's worked pretty well. It makes And it also leads to coming up with more original ideas, because, if you look at the brain supplement market, it's just the same 20 ingredients, give or take a few, remixed hundreds and hundreds of times. Because all these people, they look at these single ingredient studies that only look at one ingredient at a time, and they just go, they're all looking at the same stuff, and very little new comes out, and so they all use the same ingredients, and then so it's all like hundreds of copycat products. And I like to come up with my own ideas and my own theories and test them, and not everything works. There's some weird supplements out there that try to have a whole supplement graveyard of and not everything was optimal. And I've just settled on the stuff that I can take for months and feel great and not have any problems with. And we've been pretty successful with that strategy.
Let's talk about the last of the brain food supplements, and I guess first actually talking about what actually acetylcholine is and why it's important.
Okay. Acetylcholine is very important for memory, and it's also important for physical coordination. For instance, in all of your muscles, they're activated by acetylcholine being released, and then being broken down by acetylcholine esterase. Acetylcholine esterase breaks down is a very fast acting enzyme, breaks down like 25,000 acetylcholine molecules a second. So it's, just for moving around and doing stuff, it's really really important. But it also is important for transmission of signals throughout the brain. They're involved in thinking and learning and memory. And a lot of neurodegenerative diseases have symptoms of low acetylcholine, and they that leads to decreased memory and so forth. And that's why, like, a lot of the drugs that are prescribed for neurodegenerative diseases are interfere with acetylcholine esterase and slow the breakdown of acetylcholine. So the way that the acetylcholine brain food works is, you have choline, which comes from alpha, and there's a lot of different types of choline. There's like CDP choline and alpha GPC, and then cholebutyroid. And alpha GPC is only one step removed from the bioactive neurotransmitter acetylcholine, so I just chose that one because it was the most direct. And then the vitamin B1, it's basically a cofactor in making the acetyl-CoA, which is where the acetyl part of the acetylcholine comes from. It's combined with via choline acetyltransferase to produce the acetylcholine neurotransmitter. And then pantethine is a highly potent form of vitamin B5, which is the CoA part of, used in creating the acetyl-CoA that produces the acetylcholine. And then peony is, that's another product of, the analysis of Chinese traditional medicine that's been going on over the last 20 or so years. And there was a study that said that increases the activity of chat, and also has some effect on the breakdown of acetylcholine esterase. But it's not a really strong one, acetylcholine esterase inhibitor, because I'm not really a big fan of Hoperzine, which is the acetylcholine esterase inhibitor in a lot of smart drugs, just because it's a little too strong. I mean, also galantamine, that's crazy strong. And then acetylcarnitine also, creates acetyl molecules to join in the acetylcholine production. So I'm thinking about, so what I did when I created this was I looked at, well, how does the brain actually make acetylcholine? Where does this all, what are all the metabolic steps that combine to created. And that's essentially, I analyzed that and all the ways that I could help that along. And that's where, and then I tested it for a couple of months on myself, just every day. And that's how I came up with the acetylcholine brain food.
What's your opinion on stacking stacks in the sense of, you mentioned just recently about acetylcholine being really important for memory. So what happens? I mean, is it a good idea if someone takes the acetylcholine brain food with CILTEP at the same time? Are there certain, can you stack CILTEP with some of these brain food products? And if so, are there any good ones to combine or not so good ones?
Just over the years, I take them all. Sometimes, I usually check in with like a Braverman neurotransmitter test that I was talking about, and based on that, decide how many of each I'm going to take, like 1, 2, 3, and combine it with CILTEP. But the thing is that like, for instance, dopamine and serotonin, they're different things. They don't overlap very much. Same with GABA. It's there's not a lot of overlap in their function. I mean, if people say that CILTEP though and dopamine brain food together are really great, and then we sell like a brain food box which has all 4, and then you can kind of experiment with like what works for your brain. And I don't think there's there are some there's some synergistic actions with like prescription medications. Like people have bad reactions when they take CILTEP and modafinil together. It's not pleasant. I mean, nothing really bad happens. It's just not pleasant. I would advise against taking like really strong stimulants with CILTEP. I'd just be careful with that. Just as far as like combining natural stacks products, I haven't seen any problems with it.
Well, Abelard, we're coming up onto the end of the show. Any kind of closing thoughts related to our discussion of any of the neurotransmitters or ways to increase them? Actually, you know what? I had one quick question I did want to ask you before that, which is neurotransmitter testing. You mentioned just sort of an online like testing, but as far as actually measuring neurotransmitters in a human body, I'm aware of like certain urine neurotransmitter metabolite tests, but there's been a lot of debate as far as the accuracy of those. So what's your opinion on just kind of what's available for scientifically testing the levels of neurotransmitters at this stage of scientific research?
Well, I think that the blood tests and so forth, they're they have their medical uses, but I think that everybody's a little different, and I don't really have any as far as the breakdown byproducts, I don't really have any strong feelings on those tests. I mean, I think they're more useful for like pathological situations where people are have diseases and that kind of thing, where they're extremely poor metabolism of those kind of things. I don't really have any strong feelings on those.
Sure. Well, Abelard, if people want to find out more about your work or some of the products that you've helped create, where would you direct them to?
Well, naturalstacks.com and axonlabs.io. I also, those are the 2 sites that have products I've developed. And we also have a 15% off coupon code at Natural Stacks, which is Roscoe, ROSCOE. So for your listeners.
Awesome.
And I'm also on Twitter. I don't tweet that much, but when I announce that I'm going to be at conventions or releasing new products, I'm at Twitter at CILTEP, CILTEP.
Perfect. Well, for those listeners who enjoyed the show, go ahead and like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're Roscoe's Wetsuit Neuro. You can also find audio versions of the podcast available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and just about anywhere else that audio podcasts are available. So go ahead and also subscribe there on your preferred audio podcast platform. You can also go ahead and follow us on Instagram at Roscoe's Wetsuit Neuro or Twitter, Wetsuit Podcast. Abelard, again, I wanted to really thank you for coming on the show today and sharing all of your expertise. Really enjoyed our talk.
Thanks. It was thanks for having me.